Most gardens are built to fail. They rely on three separate systems: fertilizer to feed the soil, mulch to protect it, and compost to rebuild what gets used up. Each one takes time, money, and constant work. But there is one plant that quietly replaces all three at once. It feeds the soil, shields the ground, and builds fertility every time you cut it. And once you understand how it works, you'll never look at gardening the same way again. In the past, gardens were not hobbies. They were survival systems. Every square meter had to earn its place by producing food, preserving soil, and protecting moisture. Families depended on plants that could do more than one job at once. A plant that fed the soil, shaded the ground, and supported crops was far more valuable than one that only produced food. Efficiency was the difference between stability and hunger. By the end of this video, you will know one of the most powerful plants ever used in productive gardens. A crop that improves soil, blocks weeds, and keeps producing without needing to be replanted. You will understand how it replaces fertilizer, mulch, and compost with a single living system, and why it was once considered a cornerstone of resilient, low-effort food production. Modern gardens are built very differently. Today, everything is separated into products. Fertilizer comes in bags, mulch comes in bales, compost comes in bins. Each one works, but each one requires money, time, and constant attention. When one part fails, the whole system becomes fragile. A missed feeding, a dry week, or a weed outbreak can undo months of work. That is not resilience. That is dependency. There is one plant that never followed this model. It grows massive leaves, sinks roots far deeper than most vegetables, and stores minerals pulled from below the reach of ordinary crops. When you cut it, it doesn't weaken. It grows back stronger. Every time it does, it creates fertility, shade, and organic matter at the same time. This plant is comfrey, and it was once a quiet backbone of serious food gardens. Comfrey's real power is hidden underground. Its roots can reach several meters deep, far below the surface layer where most plants live. Down there, it pulls up calcium, potassium, phosphorus, and trace minerals that usually stay locked away. Those nutrients travel into its thick green leaves. When the leaves are cut and dropped onto the soil, those minerals are delivered exactly where food crops need them. That makes comfrey a living fertilizer system. You don't buy nutrients, you grow them. The leaves break down quickly, releasing their stored minerals into the soil. Worms and microbes convert that green material into humus, improving structure, moisture retention, and plant health. Instead of spreading chemicals or hauling compost, you simply harvest the plant and let biology handle the rest. Comfrey also replaces mulch. Its large, heavy leaves form a dense blanket when laid on the ground. That blanket blocks sunlight from reaching weed seeds, slows evaporation, and protects delicate soil life from heat and erosion. Unlike straw or bark, comfrey stays in place and decomposes into organic matter. Every time you use it as mulch, you are feeding the soil while protecting it. The third job comfrey replaces is composting. Most compost systems require piles, turning, water, and time. Comfrey skips all of that. Its leaves decompose so fast they can be composted directly in the garden bed. Gardeners call this chop and drop. You cut the plant, drop the leaves around your crops, and nutrients are recycled exactly where they are needed. Because comfrey grows back quickly, this process can be repeated again and again. A single plant can be cut 4 to 6 times per season. Each cut creates more fertilizer, more mulch, and more organic matter. The plant never has to be replanted, and it keeps working for years. What looks like a simple leafy plant is actually a permanent soil-building machine. This kind of plant used to be common in serious gardens. But modern gardening shifted toward products and inputs instead of living systems. It became easier to sell fertilizer than to teach people how to grow it, easier to sell mulch than to show how to produce it, and easier to sell compost than to explain how plants like comfrey could replace all three with one root in the ground. That shift didn't make gardens stronger. It made them dependent. Without bags, bales, and bins, many modern gardens collapse. Comfrey represents an older way of thinking, one where plants were chosen not just for what they produced, but for what they made possible. A system that feeds itself, protects itself, and keeps giving back without demanding constant labor. One of the reasons comfrey disappeared from many modern guides is that it does not behave like a typical garden crop. Once planted, it stays. Its roots run deep, and small pieces can regrow into new plants. That makes it incredibly reliable, but it also means it must be placed carefully. In older gardens, it was planted on the edges of beds, along paths, or near fruit trees where it could work for decades without needing to be moved. There is also confusion about comfrey because not all types are the same. Some varieties spread easily by seed, while others, like the Bocking 14 cultivar, are sterile and stay exactly where you plant them. That difference matters. The productive garden versions were selected for their huge leaves and controlled growth, not for wild spreading. Choosing the right type turns comfrey from a nuisance into a precision tool. Used correctly, comfrey becomes part of the structure of your garden. It feeds fruit trees, supports heavy feeders like tomatoes and squash, and builds soil in places that are hard to maintain. You do not plant it where you till. You plant it where you want fertility to accumulate year after year. Over time, those areas become darker, richer, and easier to grow in without any outside inputs. If you are interested in building a garden that produces reliably instead of constantly struggling, this is exactly the kind of plant you need to understand. And if you want more systems like this, plants that quietly do multiple jobs at once, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Everything here is about turning small spaces into stable, low-effort food systems that actually work in the real world. Comfrey is not just useful for vegetables. It can be planted around fruit trees, berry bushes, and vines to act as a permanent nutrient pump. Every time you cut it, those nutrients go straight back into the root zone of the tree. This mimics the way forests feed themselves, where leaves fall, decompose, and return minerals to the soil without any human effort. This is why comfrey fits so well into survival gardens. It does not rely on supply chains, packaging, or outside inputs. It runs on sunlight, rain, and the minerals already in your soil. As long as the plant is alive, it keeps converting deep nutrients into surface fertility. That makes your entire garden more resilient to droughts, price spikes, and missed seasons. There are also practical ways to use comfrey beyond chop and drop. Its leaves can be steeped in water to make a powerful liquid fertilizer, sometimes called comfrey tea. This dark, nutrient-rich brew can be diluted and poured onto crops that need an extra boost, especially during flowering and fruiting. It is one of the strongest plant-based feeds you can make at home. Because comfrey grows so fast, a small patch can support a surprisingly large garden. A handful of plants can produce hundreds of pounds of green material over a season. That means more mulch, more compost, and more fertilizer without buying anything. The longer it grows, the more valuable it becomes, because its root system keeps expanding and pulling up even more minerals. What makes this truly powerful is that comfrey reduces the number of weak points in your system. You are not waiting for deliveries. You are not dependent on a single product. If one harvest fails, the soil is still improving. If money is tight, the garden keeps functioning. That kind of redundancy is what separates a hobby garden from a survival garden. By planting one comfrey patch, you are not just adding another plant. You are installing a permanent support system underneath everything you grow. Fertility, moisture control, and organic matter begin to flow through your garden without constant work. That is what it means for one plant to do the work of three, quietly, season after season, without asking for anything in return. Because comfrey is so powerful, it must be used correctly. Its leaves are rich in compounds that make them excellent for soil, but they are not meant to be eaten freely like lettuce. In large amounts, comfrey can stress the liver in humans and animals. This is why traditional gardeners treated it as a working plant, not a salad green. Its true value is in what it builds, not what it feeds directly. That misunderstanding led many people to dismiss comfrey entirely. They saw warnings about consumption and assumed the plant itself was dangerous. In reality, it is only dangerous when used in the wrong way. As a soil builder, it is one of the safest and most effective plants you can grow. Knowing what a plant is for is just as important as knowing what it is called. Another concern is that comfrey is hard to remove once established. That is not a flaw, it is the reason it works. A plant that keeps returning year after year is exactly what you want in a support role. The solution is not to avoid it, but to place it where permanence is an advantage. Along fences, near fruit trees, or at the edge of beds, comfrey becomes a fixed asset instead of a problem. When gardeners complain that comfrey took over their garden, what usually happened is that it was planted in the wrong place. A deep-rooted, fast-growing plant should never be placed where soil is tilled. Disturbing the roots creates new plants. Left undisturbed, however, comfrey stays right where it was planted and quietly does its work. This is the difference between modern gardening and system gardening. Modern gardening treats plants as temporary. System gardening treats some plants as permanent infrastructure. Once you understand that comfrey is not a crop but a support pillar, its behavior makes sense. You are not growing it to harvest once. You are installing it to serve the entire garden for decades. To start using comfrey, you do not need a large area. Even a single plant can supply mulch and fertilizer for several beds. Over time, you can add more where you need fertility the most. The key is to think of comfrey as a source of resources, not a competitor for space. It exists to feed what grows around it. Comfrey fits especially well into small gardens because it compresses multiple functions into one footprint. Instead of storing bags, piles, and bins, you store fertility in living roots. That frees up space, reduces clutter, and removes a long list of maintenance tasks. In a tight area, that efficiency is often more valuable than extra crops. Once planted, comfrey begins working immediately. It sends roots downward, collects minerals, and starts building its leaf mass. Even before the first cut, it is already improving soil structure and water movement. Over time, this creates deeper, looser, more biologically active soil, which benefits everything planted nearby. This effect is strongest around fruit trees and perennials. These plants depend on long-term soil health, not quick fixes. By cycling nutrients and organic matter back into the root zone year after year, comfrey creates a slow but powerful fertility engine that never burns out and never needs refilling. When you design your garden around living systems instead of products, everything changes. Fertility becomes something you grow, not something you buy. Protection becomes something you plant, not something you spread. And compost becomes something that happens naturally, right where it is needed. Comfrey is simply one of the clearest examples of that principle in action. Planting comfrey is simple, but placement matters. You do not put it where you plan to dig or replant every season. You place it where you want fertility to accumulate over time. The best locations are around fruit trees, along garden borders, beside compost areas, or at the ends of raised beds. Once planted, it becomes a permanent nutrient pump for everything nearby. Most gardeners start comfrey from root cuttings. A piece of root only a few centimeters long is enough to grow a full plant. That makes it easy to establish and nearly impossible to lose. You place the cutting in the soil, cover it, and wait. In a few weeks, leaves appear. Within a season, you will have a mature plant that is already ready to be cut. The first harvest usually happens when the plant reaches about knee height. You cut the leaves a few centimeters above the ground and leave the roots untouched. Within weeks, the plant will grow back even thicker. Each cut creates more material for mulch, compost, or liquid feed. The more you use it, the more it produces. To use comfrey as mulch, simply lay the leaves around the base of your crops. Over a few days, they soften and collapse, forming a dense layer that blocks weeds and traps moisture. Over a few weeks, they disappear into the soil, leaving behind minerals and organic matter. You do not need to turn or remove anything. The soil absorbs everything. To make liquid fertilizer, pack comfrey leaves into a container, cover them with water, and let the mixture ferment for a week or two. The result is a dark, nutrient-rich liquid that can be diluted and poured directly onto your plants. This is especially useful for heavy feeders like tomatoes, peppers, and squash during flowering and fruiting. A single comfrey plant can produce an astonishing amount of material. In good conditions, it can be cut 4 to 6 times a year, each time producing a thick pile of leaves. Over several seasons, that adds up to hundreds of pounds of green matter, all pulled from minerals deep in the soil and delivered to the surface for free. As you continue cutting and dropping comfrey, the soil around it changes. It becomes darker, looser, and easier to work. Water penetrates more deeply. Roots grow more freely. Crops nearby become more resilient to heat and drought. These improvements are not temporary. They build on themselves year after year. This is how one plant quietly upgrades an entire garden. It does not just feed one crop, it feeds the system. Fertility spreads outward through roots, microbes, and organic matter. What started as a single patch becomes a zone of productivity that supports everything planted around it. The longer comfrey stays in the ground, the more valuable it becomes. Its roots reach deeper, its leaves grow larger, and its ability to pull minerals increases. Unlike annual crops that reset every season, comfrey compounds its usefulness over time. It is an investment that keeps paying you back. Once you have comfrey working in your garden, many of the tasks you used to worry about simply fade away. Fertilizing becomes rare. Mulching becomes easy. Composting becomes optional. The system becomes quieter, simpler, and more reliable. That is the real gift of a plant that does the work of three. When you step back and look at what comfrey does, it becomes clear that it was never meant to be just another plant in the garden. It is a piece of living infrastructure. It replaces products, reduces labor, and strengthens the system that everything else depends on. That is why gardens that include comfrey tend to improve over time instead of wearing out. This kind of design is what separates a fragile garden from a resilient one. Fragile systems need constant inputs. Resilient systems build their own support. By growing plants that feed the soil, protect the ground, and recycle nutrients, you create a garden that keeps working even when money, time, or supplies are limited. In uncertain times, that matters. Food prices rise, fertilizers become expensive, weather becomes less predictable. A garden built on living systems can absorb those shocks. It does not collapse when one link in the chain breaks. It adapts. Comfrey is just one example of how a small design choice can create long-term stability. Most people think resilience comes from storing more. In reality, it comes from growing better systems. A pile of fertilizer runs out. A bag of mulch disappears. A compost bin empties. But a living plant that renews itself keeps going. That is the difference between using resources and creating them. This is why older garden traditions valued plants like comfrey so highly. They were not chasing maximum yield for one season. They were building soil for generations. Every cut, every fallen leaf, and every root added another layer of fertility to the land. Over time, that turned difficult ground into productive living soil. Even if you only plant one comfrey, you are taking a step toward that kind of system. You are choosing to grow your own fertility instead of buying it. You are turning sunlight into soil health, and that is one of the most powerful things a small garden can do. If you want to build a garden that actually supports you, instead of demanding constant work, start with plants that do more than one job. Comfrey is not the only one, but it is one of the best examples of how much a single plant can contribute when it is placed correctly and used with intention. A garden built this way does not need to be large, it just needs to be smart. A few key plants working together can create a system that produces food, protects soil, and renews itself quietly in the background. That is how small spaces become powerful. This is not about gardening as a hobby, it is about designing something that keeps working whether you are busy, tired, or facing difficult seasons. A plant that does the work of three is not a trick. It is a reminder that nature has already solved many of the problems we struggle with. By understanding and using plants like comfrey, you stop fighting your garden and start working with it. You let living systems handle the heavy lifting. And when that happens, food becomes easier to grow, soil becomes easier to maintain, and the entire garden becomes more stable. If this kind of system thinking is what you want more of, plants that reduce work, increase resilience, and quietly support everything else you grow, then make sure you are subscribed. This channel is about building gardens that actually last, not just look good for one season. One plant, planted once, feeding the soil, protecting the ground, and renewing fertility year after year. That is not just a crop. That is a foundation. And it is how small gardens become strong enough to feed you, no matter what the future looks like.